Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac Address. My name is Tom Connell. I'm the President of the club and Chief Election Analyst at Sky News. Today, of course, deep into election season, we have a pollsters expert forum. Given how easy polling is, I'm sure we'll just get clear, easy answers. Who wins, how many seats at the end of the election, which is happening, of course, Saturday week. Kos Samaras is Director of Strategy Analytics for the Redbridge Group. Jessica Elgood, Director of Public Affairs for Ipsos, our pollster and social researcher as well. And Sean Ratcliffe, Principal of Accent Research. Sean is a pollster and political scientist. So we're on the cusp, of course, of the 2025 election. A fascinating time. There's been a clear trend. There was the 2019 miss, which may or may not give PTSD to some of those on stage. And the 2022 near miss, which we'll expand on as well. Now, each speaker will have 6 minutes to set the scene for us. I'll then moderate and end conversation with the panel and get questions from my colleagues on the floor as well. You can follow today's conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. Please welcome. I think we've got Kos first of all.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for everyone having us here today to talk about the obvious, which is the big event on May the 3rd. What I want to do is focus on two generations which are animating the political landscape in this country now in a very significant way. Now, a lot of the media have covered the story behind the Millennial and Gen Z in terms of their potential impact, but what I want to do is provide you with some detail as to just how profound their voting behaviour, how profound the impact of their voting behaviour is going to be on the political landscape in this country. And we could see that being reflected in the polls right now. So, we go back to 2013, the last time the coalition won from opposition. The voters' roll at the time had around 20-odd% millennials on it. Fast forward to this upcoming election, and it's up to 42% if we combine both Millennial and Gen Z, and we have to combine both because they are behaving very differently to previous generations when it comes to voting behaviour. To give you a contrast, Gen X, roughly around 52%, two-party preferred, favour the Labor Party. Baby boomers, 60% favour the coalition. Millennial and Gen Z combined, it's about 60% favour the Labor Party, but the devil's in the detail here. In and amongst them all, we have the greatest number of people proportionally who support minor parties, the greatest number of people proportionally who are supporting independents, and of course, within Gen Z, our most recent key seats track analysis, where we are just surveying Liberal versus Labor contests, the Greens primary is the highest at 33, higher than Labor, higher than the Liberal Party. And so that is very different to when Gen X, my generation, were in our 20s. Yes, we were more progressive, and yes, we've become more conservative as we're getting older, but we weren't that progressive. And more importantly, we weren't that anti-establishment either. So, the impact. If we go back to 2010, for example, there were about 8 non-classical contests. The AC defines non-classical contests as a seat where there is more than just the blue and red team battling out to grab the seat. In 2022, it was into the mid-20s. At this election, highly likely it's going to bounce right into the 30s. Again, back in 2010, we had around 80-odd seats that went to preferences. 2022, 130-odd seats that went to preferences. I think at this election, we'll be lucky to see 1 or 2 that will just basically be elected on primary votes alone. Who's driving this trend? It's these generations. The other thing that these generations are doing is, of course, having an impact on the major parties and how they lose votes and how they win seats. So right now, the coalition, since I would say the beginning of March, has been losing primary votes. But historically, normally that pattern would be they lose primary votes and it all goes to Labor, or most of it goes to Labor, and we see the trend emerge. Now, what's going on here is they're losing to minor parties in very significant numbers. And then if we look at the types of people that are moving away from the coalition to minor parties, Millennial, Gen Z. Yes, there are young people who vote Conservative. But when the Conservatives lose them, it's pretty hard to bring them back. And so Of course, once you lose a vote, you're not going to get all of that value back through preferences. And so the impact of that is obvious in the two-party preferred vote for the coalition right now, where it's hovering between 48 to 47%, give or take, depending on the poll and when you're putting it out in the field. Flip side, same with the Labor Party. Labor Party over the last 18 months was in deep trouble because it was losing significant numbers of younger voters. And when we say younger, I can say younger because when I talk about a 30-year-old, they're younger to me, right? Young mums in particular, you know, women with young children who were bearing the overwhelming burden of the inflationary crisis in the outer suburbs and regions. This was the constituency that the Albanese government was really struggling with. What did they do at the beginning of March? All of you who've been following this election would know. Strong focus on health, strong focus on bringing in female influencers to talk to this generation and bring them back. So what have we seen since then? A stabilisation of their primary vote. We haven't seen an exponential growth of it. It's sitting 33, 34, a lot healthier than in 2022, but it's stable. They're not suffering attrition like the coalition are. So again, when we talk about millennials, we're talking about a very diverse group of Australians, including Gen Z. So, you know, I mentioned women with young children. The other factor is, of course, this generation is the most diverse in this country's history. So, yes, if we go out to the outer suburbs, what else do we see? Well, when we talk about millennials and Gen Z, Indian diaspora, Chinese diaspora, significant diversity, significant changing attitudes towards politics and how they view the political parties. And of course, they too, in the outer suburbs, are behaving very differently to what I would say outer suburban voters used to behave 20 years ago. So that's why I'm not a big fan when people look towards 2004, for example, to ascertain as to what will happen on May the 3rd, because we are dealing with a very different country and a very different political landscape, vastly different. And of course, in an electoral cycle or two, the generation that I've just been talking to you about will be ever so dominant. And so that fragmentation we've been talking about, we should expect that to occur more. Now, it's not all good news for Labor. So as I touched on before, Labor did lose support and they've been able to bring it back, but not, you know, that consolidation of their base is not massive. It's enough to possibly win them that election come May the 3rd. But if you look at the federal seat of Fowler in 2022, the median age of Dialee support was 28 and it was diverse. So again, young, diverse, Gen Z, millennial voters in this country, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, have got a greater tendency of shopping around and tactically voting. What else do we see about this generation when it comes to tactical voting? The teal electorates. If you look at the federal seat of Kooyong, the Labor primary collapsed to around 7% at the last federal election. Of course, when you go and talk to voters who did that, you know, okay, you voted Labor at the last election, what did you do this time? Oh, I voted independent. Why? Oh, that was the best way I can get rid of the Conservative. So the other thing about these generations I'm talking about is they are very, very astute at tactically voting to get an outcome. So we go back to Labor's problem. And I touched on Fowler, but of course, when they are presented with an opportunity to send a message to Labor, if they feel they've been ignored in historically safe Labor seats, if you give them an opportunity that works, they'll take it. And they will tactically vote to shake that cage. So what we're seeing here overall, both major parties are being challenged from their flanks in a very significant way by young Australians who are going to behave very differently with regards to voting and upend the political system as we know it. What I'm seeing from the two major parties at the moment is probably Labor having a better grip of that change and the coalition flying completely and utterly blind. I mean, I heard them at the recent campaign launch where they were referencing Menzies' forgotten people and Howard's battlers. Well, Menzies' forgotten people are probably all deceased now. Sorry, but that's the reality. And Howard's battlers are heading into retirement. So we are dealing with a very different Australia. And I think the only solution for the coalition, if they are to turn the polls around the next 2 weeks, is to pivot and find a way to talk to those younger voters that they're losing to their flank. Now, they had a pretty good policy with regards to that housing announcement. Now, their opponents said, well, that's not going to work. It doesn't increase supply. What they got right about that policy, though, is that the very people that I'm talking about, diverse outer suburban Australians, want to live in greenfield areas. They want to buy that new home in a new suburb. This is an aspiration. Rewarding them to do that through the tax system is revolutionary. So they need to do more of that. And if that is probably one very, very quick way for them to actually turn some of these polls around is amplify that announcement into these constituencies, and they might actually have a better day on May the 3rd.
Cos, thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was listening to a commentator last week, politics podcasts, can't help myself, a little bit addicted. And they said great politicians weave something new out of the threads of the moment they're in, working their way to a new narrative. And that definition made me reflect. It made me stop and think, do we have any great politicians in this election who can actually meet that definition? Is there a clear new narrative being presented to us in this campaign? And as a pollster, who have I actually encountered who actually meets that high bar? So I started my polling career back in the mid-90s. 1997 was my first election with the Blair Labour landslide, and the majority was such that it was the biggest overturning of seats since 1832. So, it was a high bar, it was a unique election. But in that election, we saw a new leader with a clear narrative of how they wanted to change British society, that vision for the future, and a real distinction from the opposition. Now, Labour, or New Labour as it was, they communicated that narrative and motivated the voters, and they actively won that victory they had. Now, the exciting prospect of 1997 turned sour and the honeymoon ended, as they always do. But the leadership and the campaign stand in stark contrast to what we're seeing in this current election. When I look at our current federal election polling data, it tells us that Australians don't view either of the candidates as great politicians by this definition. There's no sense of a clear new narrative, and it doesn't suggest that either of them are actually winning the election. Question is, who's losing it faster? So from our data, we did a recent poll of the Daily Mail, and we see Dutton's approval rating sitting at 27. Now, clearly our relationship with politicians has changed over the decades, but that's the lowest approval rating we've measured for an opposition leader this century. He's had 3 years to introduce himself to the country, and only 2 weeks to go to complete that job, but still a quarter don't have an opinion on his performance and who he is. I have 2 new voters living in my house, and I picked their brains last night in terms of what are they going to do if they made their mind up. And they said, well, who's actually running, Mum? Now, my house isn't typical. I'm a pollster. My kids get exposed to a lot of this conversation. But even they said, well, who's the Dutton bloke? Is he the one who looks a bit like Voldemort? And I stood back, I was non-judgmental, but I said, yep, that's the guy. And yet, even for them, in a house where this topic gets discussed far too much, they still didn't have that recognition of who was challenging for the Prime Minister's job. Only 30% of Australians see him as their preferred Prime Minister. And again, that's the lowest figure for an opposition leader at this point in any election this century. So that's Liberals, that's Dutton. How is the polling data looking for Anthony Albanese? Well, it's not much better. At the end of his first term, only a third of the country think he's on the right track. 42% think Labour's done a poor job and someone else should have a go. And yes, the Labour two-party preferred figure is nudging ahead, but we see their polling data is still soft, and it's softer than Liberals. And by that we mean we ask them now, how committed are you to the decision around your vote? So the Labour vote is softer than the Liberal vote. And furthermore, here we are running this, the campaign is being run through the Easter and Anzac public holidays, meaning many voters are off on leave and they're less engaged they might otherwise be. So given this slightly underwhelming position, what does the polling data tell us about why the coalition is losing this election faster than Labour? Well, cost of living is the dominant issue. That stands out from all the data. over half of voters say it's the top issue. And not just that it's the top issue, it's way ahead of any other issues that are on their agenda. But who do they think is handling it better? They are just as likely to say Labour as they are the Liberals. Now, cost of living is at heart an issue of the economy, which should be a topic that the Liberals absolutely own. And they haven't done that. Yes, they're ahead on how they handle some of their core issues, things that we would suggest are traditional Liberal areas like immigration, crime, defence. But even how they're perceived on those issues is weak compared to the historical figures. We've seen stumbles in the Liberal leadership, such as the U-turn on home working and Peter Dutton's ambivalent response to climate change in the recent prime ministerial debate. None of that's helped. But there's also something else at play in this election that we see less often, and that's the sort of atypical influence of what I'll call foreign affairs, or to be more precise, Donald Trump. If I reach out to some competitors, Resolve, who do the work for Sydney Morning Herald, they asked, what was the influence of Donald Trump in terms of how you're going to vote? And a third of Australian voters say they are less likely to vote for the coalition because of Donald Trump's impact on global events recently. And nor do they think the coalition is markedly more likely to be better handling the Trump issue than Labour. So while Peter Dutton's recent frank acknowledgement that he hasn't actually met Trump was honest, it did little to enhance voters' sense that he was well placed on handling Trump and the disruption that he brings. So in 2024, we saw lots of incumbent leaders lose national elections. I think there were more elections around the globe in 24 than any other year. Quite remarkable. So one presumption coming into this year was that, the expectation was Australian election and voters, they'd be looking for change. However, with the federal election hot on the heels of the instability that Trump has brought to, I guess, the global rule-based order, but specifically the economy over the last few weeks and months with tariffs, it's been a bit of a game changer. We've seen Peter Dutton lean into some of that rhetoric. And we've also seen things like the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians talk about making Australia great again, which reminds voters about the instability that Trump brings into our sort of politics and our world. And it might play well with some on the right who would welcome that sort of Trump-style agenda for Australia. But the polling data suggests that it's not helping the coalition reach out into that middle ground. And the middle ground is where Australian elections are won. So where does this leave us? Well, the polling data suggests that neither Labour nor the coalition have really effectively presented any sort of new narrative in this campaign so far. We've only got 11 days to go. Anthony Albanese could be well advised to actually adopt that sort of Ming vase policy, as the Poms call it, where you hold on to your lead and you carefully walk across the finishing line and don't drop that advantage. Why take risks when he doesn't have to? But in contrast, the Liberals need to actually do more to convince voters they can meaningfully impact on the cost of living crisis, and that Peter Dutton can deliver that stability that they like from Albanese. So it does suggest that they need to change the game. There's only a short amount of time available, and maybe it is a moment to do something slightly more risky. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. We'll hear from Sean finally before some questions.
Thanks, Tom. So where will the 2025 Australian federal election be won, and where will it be lost? So as a result of long-term trends and deliberate strategic decisions, particularly on the part of the coalition, the Labor versus coalition battlegrounds are disproportionately in arcs around the outer suburbs and regional areas just outside Sydney and Melbourne. However, this isn't just a contest between the Labor Party and the coalition. We're seeing increasing fragmentation, as Cos mentioned earlier. The electorate has split, and we're seeing fewer and fewer traditional Labor versus coalition contests. And that means that in addition to the well-recognised threats that are posed by community independent candidates to the coalition in metropolitan areas, particularly the inner and middle suburbs of the major metropolitan areas, There are also regional coalition electorates at risk, quite a few of them. And as Cos said, truly safe seats are becoming increasingly rare. So I want to start by talking about the metropolitan-rural divide. So it's not a secret that the coalition does better in regional seats. They've done so for many decades. But what is really interesting is over the last 2 election cycles, that divide has actually increased. So if we go back to 2004, the coalition did about 8% better in regional electorates than they did in metropolitan electorates. By 2022, this had grown to almost 11%. So a 3-point shift in the gap between metropolitan and regional electorates. And that might sound like a small shift, but when we're talking about large parts of the country, that has a big effect. What it meant was that after the 2022 election, the coalition were left with 1 seat in Greater Adelaide. They were left with 2 seats in Greater Perth. They were left with 6 seats in Brisbane, 6 in Melbourne, 5 after the Aston by-election, and 7 seats in Sydney. And most of these were on the suburban fringe. They were almost entirely evicted from the inner and middle suburbs of Australia. And based on everything we're seeing, this trend is likely to continue at the 2025 election. After the 2022 election, when the coalition was almost evicted from metropolitan or large parts of metropolitan Australia, Peter Dutton and the coalition deliberately opted to pursue an outer suburban and regional strategy. They decided that many of those inner and middle suburban seats they'd lost, some to the Labor Party, some to community independents, and in the case of Brisbane and Ryan, 2 to the Greens, were largely not really worth chasing, that they're easier or the more prudent strategy or more effective strategy was to chase seats on the fringes of the suburbs and in regional areas. So this would mean not just winning back seats like Gilmore that they've held in the past and lost, but also electorates they'd rarely ever, if ever, held before. So seats like Werriwa in Western Sydney, McEwen in the northern fringes of Melbourne, and the Hunter. These sort of seats that were traditionally relatively safe Labor seats in many cases became the new target. So in practice, this meant less focus perhaps on income tax cuts and more focus on domestic gas reserves and the threat to break up large supermarket chains and insurance companies. Policies that were traditionally not seen as sort of core liberal sort of policy areas or directions that they would go in. And in some ways, this appeared to be an adoption of the playbook of the US Republican Party. And it makes a certain amount of sense in one way of looking at it. It leans into the strengths of Peter Dutton himself. It also, and the current coalition, I don't want to pick on Peter Dutton, the coalition leadership itself is disproportionately regional in nature. The problem with this strategy, though, is the electoral math is difficult. So if we're using the US Republican Party as a guide, the US electorate is slightly more rural and ex-urban than the Australian electorate. And the political geography of the US Senate and the Electoral College itself somewhat favours smaller and more rural states. So that strategy of pursuing a more regional and rural and outer suburban electorate does make a lot of sense in the US if you're the Republican Party, perhaps less so if you're the coalition in Australia, where the House of Representatives is generally more reflective of the population distribution of Australia, which is predominantly metropolitan. So this means that the contest between the Labor and the coalition, at least, looks to be set to be decided in seats along 2 large arcs that sweep around our 2 largest metropolitan areas. So the first of these starts north of Sydney, around Port Stephens in the seat of Patterson. It moves south through the Hunter, which was looking a little bit shaky for Labor perhaps late last year, but is firming up now by the looks of it. Then down through the Central Coast, which contains 3 marginal Labor-held seats, around the west of Sydney, and then down to the south coast of New South Wales in the seat of Gilmore. This first arc was looking like a rich environment for the coalition late last year, but now looks less inviting as the coalition's primary vote has dropped a little bit. The second arc still perhaps looks a little bit more promising for the coalition, although that might be becoming a little bit less fruitful as well. And that starts southwest of Geelong in the seat of Corangamite, then sweeps around the west and north of Greater Melbourne through seats like Hawke and McEwen, then down around the outer eastern suburbs along the Dandenong Ranges through seats like Casey and into Bruce. So these areas don't contain, and I want to make that clear, don't contain every marginal seat in the country or even in New South Wales or Victoria. But they do contain around a dozen potential battleground seats. Most of them are Labor held, and if the coalition were to win government at this election, they would need to do well in both regions. It looks very difficult for them to win if they don't do well in both of those regions. However, as I mentioned, and as Cos spoke about a bit earlier, this picture is complicated by declining party loyalty and a fracturing electorate. So it's not just a contest between the Coalition and the Labor Party. Obviously, there are other parties and candidates involved, and voters' loyalties to political parties are weakening. So we've seen over the past year, nearly half of all voters are soft, and while that's firming up a bit now, there are a large number of voters that are willing and are moving around. So younger voters, as Cos mentioned in particular, are more likely to be open to changing their vote or supporting a minor party or independent candidate. And this makes the electorate more volatile. So as a result, even as longer term trends and shorter term strategic decisions move the coalition's centre of gravity further towards rural and regional Australia than it already was, and the Labor Party to the inner and middle suburbs to a certain extent, political fragmentation threatens to pull the rug from under both parties. So the coalition, as a result, is struggling to hold a lot of seats that were traditionally safe, its safer seats. So it bears thinking about that the seat of every recent Liberal leader and treasurer, except Scott Morrison's cook, is either held by a community independent or at risk of falling to one. They've lost Bennelong, which was John Howard's seat. They've lost Kooyong, which was Josh Frydenberg's seat. They've lost Higgins, which was then abolished to Labor, which was Peter Costello's seat. They've lost North Sydney, which was Joe Hockey's seat, and then abolished. So they're losing these seats that were traditionally the seats of their leadership, and they don't look, where those seats haven't been abolished, they don't look like they're likely to win them back. So in addition to potential weaknesses against community independence, though, in these metropolitan seats like Bradfield at this election, the coalition is also bleeding votes to independence in rural areas. So potentially putting seats like Cowper, Calare, Monash and Wannon in play. Labor also faces these risks, although they look a little bit less immediate perhaps at this election, but there are in traditionally safe seats like Western Sydney and the inner suburbs of most, or inner city of most of our major metros, to the Greens and potentially independents as well, so it's not just a coalition problem. And what is important to note is this fragmentation is not an accident. This isn't voters accidentally supporting options other than the coalition or the Labor Party and accidentally pushing us into hung parliament territory. In recent research, we found that voters' preferences for majority government are actually really weak. Only 56% of voters actually think that a majority Labor or coalition government is better for Australia than some other alternative. 44% believe that some kind of minority government would actually be better for the country. And this is a real generational divide. It is primarily voters aged 65 and older that prefer a majority government. 60% of those aged 18 to 34 think a minority government would be better for Australia, as do 58% of those aged 35 to 49. 59% of those in a great deal of financial stress believe that a minority government would be better for Australia, and 62% of renters. So a large share of important demographics in the electorate actually believe that a minority government rather than a majority Labor or coalition government would be better for the country. So it's not an accident that some of these voters are voting for independence or the Greens, but then secretly hope for a majority government. So young renters who earn more than their parents but cannot afford to buy the house they grew up in have little reason to preserve the existing political order and appear happy to roll the dice on a minority government. These voters are more likely to come down on the left than the right, but overall they appear to prefer anti-system parties more than anything else. They're driving the fragmentation of the Australian political system and pushing us towards minority government. Whether we see a hung parliament or not after this election, this outcome should not be perceived as an accident. Most of those who plan to give their vote to a minor party or independent aren't doing so with the hope they get a majority government. They're actively seeking an alternative. Thank you.
Sean, thank you. I like the stat on the former treasurers and PMs. I'll be borrowing that for my coverage.
As long as you attribute me.
Of course, of course.
Citation.
So 2019, as I alluded to, basically the result missed by pollsters. 2022 It feels to me like it was a bit of a bullet dodge because of that Labor primary was also largely missed. How much, one briefly for each of you perhaps, how much confidence do you have that the current polling, of course the aside is, not the commentary on the polling equals certain victory, but that the polling is relatively accurate in 2025? Who wants to start?
I can kick off. I'll kick
I
off.
always look at Cos.
Always look at me.
Cos?
See, polling, and I always emphasise this, is a diagnostic tool. It should be used to inform and educate the Australian public, the media, and the political class of what is actually going on electorally right now. So the trends are pretty clear. So the polling right now with regards to the generations that we've been talking about are pretty clear. So young Gen Z voters, there is a big seismic shift to the Greens. That's clear. Millennials, the two-party preferred vote, amongst those voters, 60%. Now, that's clear. So then what do we do with those polling numbers? We go and have a look at which electorates have got large numbers of these voters. And that then tells us, okay, so you can build an error margin into that and you're still going to see a very significant two-party preferred vote for the Labor Party. So you can safely then, extrapolate into a number of electorates out there where these two generations are dominant. That makes the electoral landscape, as Sean articulated just before really well, very, very difficult for the coalition when you're seeing these sort of trends in polling numbers.
Jessica, trend has been the really stark thing in the past few weeks. Does that give you more confidence that the current polling is pretty accurate, how uniform the trend has been?
It's a consistent measure, Tom, seeing it poll after poll after poll. And yes, there's variations. Some have a larger 2PP lead for Labour, some have less, but it's a consistent movement. So don't look at one poll on its own, look at the direction of travel, and we can see that from the polls. So a poll of polls is always quite a useful data point to look for, and I know some of the blogs provide that, and you can see that direction of travel. So it's not to say we won't have overestimated Labour's performance. Let's see what happens. But we have consistent travel, but then also we have a really consistent narrative behind that direction of travel. So there's a whole load of supporting evidence in terms of we ask questions like, who do you think is going to win? Which party has the momentum? Things like that. And that suggests there's that sense amongst the electorate that it's slipping away from the Liberals.
Various pollsters ask the question, who do you think will win? Which is often pointed to as good evidence because people will say, I want Team Blue or Team Red to win, but I think the other one will win. And I've seen those numbers shift really quickly, Sean. Is that another confidence point, or is that a bit of a cheap seats view, do you think?
So everyone assumes that elections are like the favourite time for pollsters, and it's actually the worst time for pollsters, right? I think the others agree. We get no sleep, and then election night is this stressful period where you're just waiting for people like yourself to call the election and tell you whether you're right or not. The trend has been strong. I've never seen anything quite like the last couple of months, not at the federal level. State level tends to be a bit more volatile, but the shift has been massive. So either something big's going on or we're really, really wrong. And unfortunately, we don't get to find out until you do.
You're more nervous than the politicians, following up.
Well, maybe equally nervous.
Jobs on the line everywhere.
We've all got a lot on the line. We've got skin in the game.
Yeah. Well, given your schedule, we appreciate your time here to enlighten us all. You spoke about still Labor being the softer vote. Is that a big caveat that people have shifted back, but it's not to the warm embrace of the Labor Party?
Look, it's not a warm embrace. The whole election feels a little lukewarm. People aren't passionate about either direction, so it is a lukewarm embrace. Yeah, so is it a caveat? Well, yes, but along with the fact that we will have, I don't have the figures, but I would guess around 10% currently undecided. It's not going to...
8% for us.
8%?
For
it's
us.
not going to move all in one direction or the other, Tom. It'll split, it'll fragment, but it will move. Some of that will firm up. So yeah, there is still change. However, here we are with another public holiday on Friday. We have early voting starting this morning. The votes available are narrowing. So actually, sure, things can still move, but less and less as every day goes by. is there scope to change the path
Yeah,
forward?
about half the vote is done early overall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the important point here is when we talk about soft votes, let's say soft votes within Labor's base, that doesn't mean you've got a potential large hemorrhage that's going to head towards the coalition. It just means you have a large number of people who are going to potentially tactically vote when you present them with an opportunity for the parties of the left and independents that are progressive. That's usually what happens. What we're seeing less and less of is the two majors feeding into each other, right? So this is where the coalition is really struggling at the moment, is that they missed the golden opportunity for them, which was to convert that disaffected vote that Labor lost over the last 18 months early this year. That vacuum they created by not doing anything in March is where I think it's cost them potentially the election.
The pre-budget period,
Yes.
where they post-Cyclone Alfred. You mentioned as well preferences. It strikes me that right now the equation is become quite tilted against the coalition. You've got seats where the coalition helped Labor get over the line against the Greens, and yet you've got seats as well where Labor helped independents get it over the line against the coalition. Is that a lack of agility? I mean, I feel like if you told the coalition in 2010 this is where you end up, they'd say, well, how are we going to win elections doing it that way? Have they missed a trick there, do you think? Weighing with the right cause?
Well, I think they've been caught in a pincer of seismic demographic shifts with regards to how people have changed in terms of their voting behaviour. So in urban, highly educated constituencies, right across the Western world, are moving to the parties of the left, and I don't think it's something they could avoid, and it's something that the Labor Party had to confront, with regards to losing seats to the Greens, and it's probably accepted it now. But I think what I'm still seeing on the coalition side is this denial that they're going to win back these, once upon a time safe seats. When, yeah, sure, some of them might come back, but it'll be temporary.
You were talking about this, Sean. So has it become either or? It's harder to broadcast in today's society. You can't say something here and hope it doesn't, make it to the East Coast or cities or suburbs or whatever it might be. Did they need to pick the coalition on the outer suburban strategy versus the city seats, which you're saying, they're evicted from the major cities, as you put it?
I don't think they needed to entirely pick. I think it's a balancing act, and that was something the coalition was very, very good at for a very long time. One of the reasons they were effectively dominant at the federal level in Australia was that they performed very, very well in the inner and middle suburbs, while also winning a majority of seats outside the metropolitan areas. That made them hard to beat, and by essentially giving up on some of these, or at least playing, not chasing those seats they lost in 2022 in the inner and middle suburbs, not chasing them as hard as they could, they've had to essentially go hunting in territory that was not traditionally very friendly for the coalition. And that doesn't mean those seats are impossible, it doesn't mean they can't win the election on that strategy, but I think it makes their job actually a little bit harder than it would be otherwise.
I'll go to my colleagues in just one moment. One for more for you, Jess. You mentioned Donald Trump and how that's playing out. It seems to me Peter Dutton's been fairly cautious about, trying to woo that vote too much. But has there been enough snippets, efficiency? Senator Nambajimpa Price and her line there, is that enough cut through for people to draw a link, or is it more the handling? Because the polling on handling him has actually been much stronger, if you like, than Peter Dutton being Trump 2.0.
And it's always difficult to know how much actually the broad swathe of the public are paying attention to some of these things. Like, really, did Jacinta Price's comment there really cut through? Did it get pick up? I don't know. I think it's very interesting that you see both in Canada and Australia effectively two incumbents potentially being returned when that didn't look like it was going to be the case. And actually, as much as, yes, there are those moments where the Liberals have maybe lent into some of the Trump narrative around efficiency or let's make Australia great again, there is also the point that they're just looking that sense of concern around the disruption and that just wanting the stability, not want to welcome in as many of us, I would guess, perceive, the level of chaos just that heightened disruption that he's brought. So actually, is it less about the Liberals and just more about steady as you go? Albanese is a known quantity.
And it takes 30 seconds to check your superannuation balance these days, doesn't it? All right, let's go to the floor to my colleagues. Ron Meisen begins from the Australian Financial Review.
Thank you so much for taking the time out from your busy schedules for your insights. I'm hoping to get each of you to delve a little bit further into one of the really big policy areas of this campaign and how it's flowing through demographically, and that's housing. We've seen since the last election in many electorates a significant uptick in property values, Perth in particular, Adelaide, to some extent Brisbane. We've seen inverse to that some falls around those orbital seats that you've referred to in Sydney and Melbourne, including some reductions in even sort of rent to income ratios. I'd be keen to just get you to delve into, to the extent that you can, each of you, how the housing crisis is playing out among each of the different demographics that you've talked about, Gen Z, millennials, etc., and then also how that's playing out from an electorate by electorate, seat by seat battleground state as well, if you can.
Me first?
Yeah,
Yep.
we'll go left to right.
Okay, great. I'm not going to do every seat. That's okay, or 150.
We've got time.
We'll be here for a while if I did, but yeah, I think it does play out differently in obviously different parts of the country and also different demographics. So when we've looked at the salience of housing, so it always ranks as one of the top issues when we ask voters to nominate what issues are most important for their vote. So usually we find housing comes in second or third. So cost of living is the dominant one by a long way, and then it's normally some combination of housing and health, or health care than housing. When we get voters to rank their top three, and we actually ask them in some of the polling we do, we don't give them a list, we actually ask them to nominate the issues, so we're not sort of predisposing them to particular outcomes. We actually ask them to write the issues in a text box in some of our surveys, and they do nominate housing a lot. So around a third or so of the electorate in a lot of our surveys ranks housing as one of their top three issues. But there's a big generational gap there, so that's around half of voters, Gen Z voters, rank housing as their top issue. Well, that drops way back as you go to, it drops back a bit as you go to millennials and Gen Z, where it is around a third, Gen X, it's about a third, and then it drops back further if you go to baby boomers. So the older, essentially, voters get, the less likely they are to prioritise housing. So it's definitely got a generational component. It also does have a location component. So obviously this issue is most acute where housing costs are high. So Sydney in particular, it's a particular, not just the inner city though. So I think a lot of people think, oh, this is millennials and Gen Z being picky. They all want to live in really nice apartments with harbour views. But you look at Sydney and you can go 30 kilometres out and it's not cheap. You're still looking at over $1 million for a house, not far under $1 million for an apartment in a lot of outer suburban neighbourhoods. So you can go to the Central Coast and you're still looking at $800,000 for a house, right? Which for a young home buyer, that's still quite a lot of money. So it's quite acute in some markets where housing costs are high. And so what you're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, is you're seeing young voters, some of whom, but this is particularly an issue in the sort of teal seats, the seats won by community independents the last election. You're seeing young people with very high incomes. These are affluent electorates, but they're either still renting or they've bought a one-bedroom apartment for $1.3 million. And these are people that are earning often substantially more than their parents in many cases, but they can't afford to buy the house that they grew up in. So that does create a frustration, obviously. And what we're seeing is these voters, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, they're saying the major parties aren't doing anything about this problem, not anything concrete, and they're switching mostly to the Greens, but also to other minor parties and independents. And they're actually, a lot of them are saying, I would rather a minority government than a majority Labor or coalition government, because I think that, and for a lot of them it's because they think maybe then something will be done about this problem.
Jess?
Look, my data largely echoes Sean, so I'll keep my answer short. But for me, it's a timing issue in terms of how the campaigns have played this issue. So it's too little, too late in terms of the focus. It does come in as a second or third issue because effectively it's a sub-part of the cost of living. It's all part and parcel of the same major issue impacting on that generational shift that Cos talked about that's actually really going to shape the votes. And this just needed to be more upfront, earlier, clearer, louder about how they could make that difference. And they haven't been. And so it's late in the day, and really will those younger voters be able to pick those policies apart and work out which is actually better in their interest when many are not paying huge amount. The election is not the most important thing going on in their lives. So my feedback on it is actually just that the campaign needed to go harder and faster on
So
the
briefly
issue.
on that, the hold it back strategy, that adage, hasn't worked this time.
There's not a lot of time left.
Mm.
Yeah. And yet it's a key driver.
Yeah,
You know?
and launches on the same day might not have helped. I was trying to figure out the policies. Cos?
Yeah, well, it goes to the point around the day they chose the coalition to announce that policy that I touched on in initial delivery, and that is that, you know, they waited way too late. They should have actually probably announced it last year and marketed it for an entire 12 months. Why? Well, these generations and generations that we're talking about are also, you know, they've grown up with one of these in your pockets, right? And basically, they can access information how they want, when they want. They're not tethered to a desk, and they're very hard to get to. So waiting for the last 2 weeks. This is why I find particularly the coalition, but Labor's is not much far off from this. They've approached this problem, being the housing problem, in a very traditional marketing way, and that is wait until the election period, then come out with the solutions. What that does, it drives a cynical radar through the roof, right? So these voters already know that the system's stacked against them. They already know that they are going to live a life far lesser in terms of quality than their parents. And lo and behold, the solutions appear in election time. And of course, these generations are also the most savvy and cynical. So when we speak to voters and we say, well, what do you think of these policy announcements? Their response is, I don't think they'll build more homes. I've not seen any evidence of it yet. This government's been in power for 3 years and they've done nothing. And what about the coalitions? Yeah, I don't believe it. They'll break the promise. You know, again, because their lived experience is one of being let down.
Yeah, and the neither or don't know party would win government if it were an election on housing, from the polling I've seen. Next question from Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. There's three issues where there's a pretty marked difference between the major parties. Firstly, immigration, levels of immigration. 2, nuclear power. And 3, Indigenous affairs. I'm interested in your reflections on how those 3 policy areas are important across the generations and across those electorates where you see change possible.
Go the other way this time.
Right to left.
What was your first one again?
Immigration.
Immigration.
Yeah, okay, so immigration is extremely complex. Again, the difference between the electorate that I've been talking about versus baby boomers could not be starker. Yes, they are concerned about the levels of immigration intake. Yes, they are concerned it puts pressure on them in terms of housing, but they don't really get into, treat refugees severely when they come here as a deterrent. So there's a stark difference between baby boomers and...
So they see it through the refugee prism, the kind of human rights prism, rather than the actual population.
They want the Australian government to treat those who are seeking refuge in this country humanely.
Okay.
But they are concerned about the level of immigration to this country, full stop. And that varies depending on where you are. And so is it an election issue? Not necessarily, because when we survey Australians, the really only stark difference we see is within baby boomers in terms of who they think is going to manage immigration better. It's largely 50-50. Again, it's a bob each way. With regards to, what was the second issue again?
There's nuclear and Indigenous.
Nuclear. Well, the one thing, nuclear. The one thing that actually has worked for the Labor Party is its negative campaign on nuclear. So they've successfully been able to basically build a narrative that Peter Dutton is going to build these nuclear reactors with money that he's going to harvest via cuts, right? And when we test that proposition, it rates its socks off. Yeah, that's absolutely fundamental. If there's a comment I can make on nuclear, that's exactly what's going on right now in the electorate. it helps lock in the Labor base. It's not the reason why the coalition's losing young voters to right-wing minor parties and other independents. That's more to do with a loss of confidence that they don't have an economic plan, right? And to your third one, which is Indigenous, I don't think it's an issue as a political issue. I think both major parties are staying away from that issue for obvious reasons.
I'm going to jump in on the nuclear point there, Simon. It's not high on people's list.
Yeah.
Sean talked about spontaneously asking people what are the things concern them. People don't mention nuclear. They're only mentioning it because Peter Dutton's mentioning it every now and again. But what the Liberals have failed to do is connect the need to nuclear through to a successful clean energy policy. They've not tied them together as issues tightly enough. And if they'd done that, there is concern out there. There's concern that the renewables do not deliver the base load that we need in terms of energy supply to be really reliable. But they failed to connect the two. So it's a slightly irrelevant issue that, as Cos has explained, scares people in terms of actually what the meaning is in terms of how it plays through.
So a nuclear plus renewable tagline should have been the one?
Tying it together, making the connection, and also showing that, actually, yeah, we have a meaningful green energy policy, and it means ensuring that baseload is safe by having the nuclear there, and they haven't made that connection. I would second what Cos is saying in terms of policies for First Nations Australians. If you remember the Prime Ministerial debate last week, the interviewer put that point to both candidates, and they didn't have anything to say. It just fell flat. It's not an issue that's concerning most people.
Sean,
sadly.
You can pick what you'd like out of those.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the coalition has, at least to a certain degree, tried to make its nuclear policy and its immigration policy kind of cost of living policies to a certain degree. The nuclear was about providing reliable baseload power that they argued would be cheaper than Labor's more renewable focused approach. And they, to the extent they've touched on immigration, it'll lower the cost of housing. I just don't think they've done a very good job. So I don't think they've convinced voters that nuclear will lower their energy bills or make energy more reliable.
And on the short term, gas was their answer to that. And that was so late in terms of detail.
Yeah, I think if you were going to, the nuclear policy was kind of a flagship policy for the coalition, but they sort of dropped it out there on its own, and there was no energy policy built around it. And you would have thought you might have released the gas policy at the same time as part of a broader, much more developed energy policy that would credibly point to how a coalition government would provide Australia with a clean, affordable energy supply.
Next question, Mark Kenny from the ANU.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all for your contributions so far. Mark Kenny from ANU Democracy Sausage and also the Canberra Times. Just on that nuclear question, as a brief first comment, if someone wants to respond, your point, Jessica, about tying it with renewables would be a classic example of a policy going to Cos's other point of a policy that should have been done a long time ago, because the coalition would really struggle, I think, to own the renewable space given its own record in that space. I'll leave that with you. I just wanted to perhaps invite you to do something else that's hypothetical, but I suppose a lot of this is hypothetical anyway, and that is the numbers seem to be pointing to a Labor win, either in majority or minority, probably more likely the latter. But let's remember 2019 and let's remember some other election results where things have happened late or things have not been picked up because of the very subterranean nature of campaigning now in the digital world. So I wonder if I could invite you to think about the sorts of things you might be saying on those comments desk on election night, if in fact it's gone the other way. What would be the dominant thing you think that will have delivered that upset result that would be the first time an opposition has only served one term in opposition and come back again in the next election?
Pretty clear, and that is that the angst that's built up within the electorate, particularly out of suburban Australia and regional Australia, was so great that it toppled a number of seats in very unexpected ways. Now, that will be predominantly Melbourne and Sydney, as Sean articulated before. There will be some in the regions, of course. But it'd be a continuation of what is the trend, and that is that Labor is increasingly becoming, yes, it's increasingly becoming an urban political movement, but it's increasingly becoming better at defending seats that are middle urban, inner urban. So the safest seat, the most stable seat, I'll say safest is probably not the right term anymore, the most stable seat in Melbourne for Labor is Jagga. Now, I'm old enough to remember, because I used to work on the Labor side of politics and running their campaigns, that was a marginal seat once upon a time. You know, you worried about that seat on election night. That's now got a stable primary vote that doesn't move. The ones that are keeping Labor Party officials awake at night right now are the ones in the west of Melbourne, historically Labor safe seats. So that my commentary that night will be, well, looks like the dam did break and the Red War has come down.
I guess it will have done so relatively quietly, or what? Would the assumption be, Jess, that people switched off halfway through the term, stopped engaging, because it would be a reasonable miss from where we sit right now?
Halfway through the term or halfway through the campaign? Because I don't feel that the electorate are particularly switched on with the campaign. So yes, have they missed these things during the actual term itself, but also the government's ability to be getting its message out there is not particularly compelling. So I think there's a variety of things there.
Yeah, well, I mean, 2 months ago we wouldn't have been surprised, right, if the coalition won.
Yeah.
And cost of living would probably be the main reason. We were seeing by early to middle of last year, even when Labor was still ahead in polling, voters were rating them very, very poorly on the issues that they thought were most important, particularly cost of living, but also housing, healthcare, pretty much everything. Yeah, they still do. So that's
the Liberals are losing it, aren't they?
The government,
they're losing it faster than Labor.
That's right. So the government is still quite poorly rated on the issues that. So even in the polls that we have now, where we've got Labor ahead, the government is quite poorly rated on the issues that voters care about. I don't think there's a single issue in the sort of top 5 or 6 that there's a positive Labor rating. Not that I can think of
Not even
ahead
health.
anyway. So
I need to talk about that. She's saying how they're handling economy or cost of living. Now it's sort of slightly better than the coalition, but still not well.
Yeah. So we've seen over the last couple of months the Labor rating from voters on these issues has improved, and in some cases, not everything, but in some cases the coalition has gone backwards, but it's still not great. You wouldn't look at those scores and go, oh wow, this is a government that voters love and I can't wait to re-elect. It looks more like a story of this. They've looked at the coalition and they've gone, actually, maybe I won't change government right now.
Yeah.
So
And they've
there
not-
for the taking, is there that sense?
They've not reached into each other's territory either as well, in terms of who's handling which issue better. You know, when you see someone who's got momentum, they're reaching into the other person's territory. They're challenging Liberals on running the economy, they're challenging Labor on their education plans, whatever it might be. You see that exchange in the data. It's not there.
It's because both voters think that both sides are messing this up,
Yeah.
right?
Just
across all
agree.
policy.
I'll add some spice to the panel and disagree with Jess on something. In the latest news poll, actually, we have the Labor Party ahead of the coalition on who's better for tax cuts, I think it is.
Yeah, lower taxes.
Yeah, right. Which that is
Significant.
actually.
Yeah, that is.
That's I can't remember the last time I saw the Labor Party rated better than the coalition on who's better to provide lower taxes.
And better on housing, which things like housing and energy feel like an incumbent disadvantage at the moment. Whomever's in charge, they're not doing a
absolutely.
good job and they're still ahead on housing, albeit only just ahead of nobody,
Yeah.
which was one of the answers there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question from Julie Hare from the
Excuse me.
AFR.
Thank you both. Oh, thank you all very much. I'd like to ask you about the collective imagination and whether such a thing still exists, or whether the community is so fractured that we can't get there anymore. So I guess I'm getting to a point where Jess was talking about the lack of visionary leadership. So you talked about New Labor and Tony Blair. There's a lot of commentary around about Anthony Albanese's timidity. And we see a lot of the important policy debates going on among the community independents. In fact, the Allegra spenders of this world are actually the ones who are promoting big ideas. Why is it that the major parties have failed to find leadership that is forward-leaning and can speak to people in a way that Hawke and Keating and, Whitlam, I guess, did? And I guess the same goes for the coalition. And is it that they're always trying to speak across multiple communities all the time and can't gather the collective imagination together?
I can kick
Well, I
off
think
on that because I've worked with them all. I think they've been brought up on a diet of yesteryear, and that basically being managing the news cycle, putting out controlled narratives. Most of the politicians in both camps right now have worked as either staffers or within political circles, where they've basically grown up in this culture, and are unaware that there is a growing number of Australians, and I've spoken about them, who are starving for that vision. The one thing that comes up in our research all the time is that these two offer me no hope. There's no vision here. There's no hope. I'm going to vote for the Labor Party because they're the least worst option.
How can they be unaware of it, though? I mean, if it's coming up in your polling all the time, it must be going over there.
So really, I think what we'll see is in the years to come, the electorate is going to force change within the major parties. And there's a conversation going on the Labor side of politics in particular, particularly in Melbourne, where there's this new generation that just came in at both federal and state and thought they were grabbing themselves lifetime careers in safe seats, and suddenly they're door knocking. Right, their life has changed completely. They're marginal seat MPs. So now what I'm trying to suggest here is that fragility is going to create demand from the majors internally to produce good politicians. Otherwise, you lose your seats.
So there's hope.
There's hope.
Got to get to the last question in a moment. Partly it was to you, Jess, so I just want to get you quickly on this.
Sure.
Would it be harder being Tony Blair in 2025 than 1997?
Oh.
Whether it be Australia or Britain or...
Okay, the Tories were so busy annihilating themselves. There was a programme, there was a moment of change, and you can feel that. And, I'm a relatively new Australian, I've only been here 15 years, but for me, isn't it the Kevin 07 moment that, you had here? There was that sense of change, that sense of vision, a new voice, a new moment. And those elections don't come around every day. And in terms of, I think, what we're saying about the leadership with Dutton and Albanese is they're no different. And so the accusations we're making here, it's the same. We could have said it 3 years ago, and we could have said it 3 years before then. I look back on our 2019 polling, and one of the things I reflect on that I could have done better was the qualitative data that we bring to the numbers. And actually in our focus groups, yes, Labour are ahead, but there was no passion for Shorten as a leader. And again, I feel our polling data at the moment actually this time shows there's no passion for either of them. Sadly.
I guess 2019 was the last time we heard how someone would pay for something, and people didn't seem to like it as well. Final question from Dominic Giannini from AAP.
Thanks, Al. I just wanted to ask, major parties usually don't tackle big reforms or holistic reforms because they're scared about how it'll play in the electorate and a scare campaign from the other side. If all of your polling shows differently and the electorates are becoming younger, why are the leaders still so uninspiring to these people?
Right. I can only shake my head because it's again going back to the point I made, which is they are scared of tackling the big issues because they think that their opponent's going to weaponise it against them. What they fail to realise is that there's probably more electoral reward in doing that than negative, as in a consequence of doing it. So. Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for example, the issue around housing, most voters know that what's been proposed helps, but it's a band-aid. When you look around the issue of tax and how tax is treated in this country, particularly amongst younger workers, most of these voters know that no one's serious about talking about tax reform that helps them, so helps their small businesses to prosper. I was asked a question about a week ago as to what I would do if I was the coalition. I'll say, well, where's your significant tax reform for small business? They employ 5.2 million people. It's the new working class in Melbourne's western suburbs and Sydney's outer western suburbs. And what we know for a lot of our research is that those employees are incredibly loyal to their employers. So again, significant reform in that space would have helped the coalition.
So on that, nearly out of time, but Sean, you can make things spicy again and take aim at the fourth estate if you like on this one. Is it this sort of no one can be worse off mantra in politics? If you talk about reform in any of these areas, the first thing sometimes the media go, oh, this person's going to lose X dollars.
Yeah, well, I think the issue is any major reform is going to have losers. right? If you change something, change the status quo, it will have losers. So housing affordability is probably, we've spoken about that a bit today. That's a good example. If you made housing more affordable, it means you're lowering the value of housing, which means that homeowners become poorer, they lose wealth. And obviously there are a number of homeowners who probably don't want to be poorer, particularly those with big mortgages that are bought in the last 5 or 10 years in expensive housing markets. So it's a difficult proposition, right? If you were serious about making housing more affordable, you would have to go to the electorate, 2/3 of whom own, right? So the majority of voters own their own home, and about 1/3 of them have a mortgage. You would have to go to them and explain to them, we're making you poorer to help this other group of voters. Now, many of them have children or grandchildren, so that might be the argument, we're helping your children or grandchildren purchase a home, but you would have to take that proposition to the electorate, and you'd have to convince a number of homeowners that making them poorer was actually a good thing to do, and that's not necessarily the easiest proposition, as Bill Shorten found out the hard way.
Yeah. Final word from you, Jess?
Look, I was just going to say, I think the system has a structural problem in it. We have a 3-year electoral cycle. In the UK it's 5 years, in the States it's 4 years. And when you go to that longer cycle, you make those tough decisions in the first 12 to 18 months. And the 3-year cycle does provide accountability, which I think is a good system, but it doesn't leave you scope to really annoy voters by doing something tough that has to be done.
Yeah, that gap between the tough meds.
And you've got a couple of years run in where you can actually start sweetening them up again before you go to the polls.
For all you fixed terms, it's always the policy tomorrow, isn't it? Well, look, we really appreciate your time. We'll remind our viewers as well, the health debate tomorrow. Talk of a dull campaign. This will be soaring debate, no doubt, tomorrow, so tune in. But look, I know it's a very busy time. Very much appreciate your expertise.
Thank you.
We've got club membership as well. You can either celebrate or drown your sorrows at the end of this whole thing. So club memberships for you all, but thank you very much.